A select group of saints shares a unique common bond. Their corpses are said to exhibit supernatural characteristics. An eerie aura. Blood and oil oozing from lifelike flesh. A sweet smell that makes passers-by swoon. Many of these bodies reportedly have remained lifelike for years, even centuries. Countless faithful believe they are the result of a divine miracle. Saints preserved. One cradles a book in her lap while sitting in a golden chair. Another's centuries-old hands hold rosary beads. One more continues to smile over 400 years after her death. They're among the 100 or so corpses of saints and holy persons once acknowledged as incorrupt by the Catholic Church.
These saints are called the incorruptibles. It means their bodies didn't corrode. It means their bodies didn't putrefy. It means their bodies remained lifelike or a lot longer than an ordinary body. That is seen as proof of some miraculous spiritual happening, because it goes against nature. Bodies don't do that. So for someone's body to have done that must mean this was a special person.
In life, these men and women created quite a stir. Some were hailed as great missionaries, while others were known for their remarkable works of mercy. So extraordinary were these saints that today, centuries later, their bodies, or body parts, known as relics, are on display, enshrined in chapels, monasteries, and basilicas in Italy and around the world.
I had a sense of wonder and awe when I looked at them. The incorruptibles were some of the best preserved bodies that I had seen.
The collection and veneration of relics of Christian martyrs began in the 2nd century.
Relic veneration in Christianity becomes a simple attachment to someone who's famous, is an exemplar of the faith, a martyr, some way of remembering them.
When Polycarp, the bishop of Smyrna, was burned at the stake in 155 AD, his followers said they
took up his bones, which are more valuable than precious stones and finer than refined gold, and laid them in a suitable place where the Lord will permit us to gather ourselves together in gladness and joy, and to celebrate the birthday of his martyrdom.
Cults of the relics grew, and by the 4th century, no church in the Holy Roman Empire could be consecrated without housing the sacred objects.
The church functions, among other things, as a holy site. The relics that are there become a way of adding to that sanctity. As you multiply the relics from different saints, you are connecting people with a whole range of holy people, each of whom has a part in that storehouse of grace. And thus you are, in one sense, multiplying the amount of grace that is available to people as they come and participate in worship.
Some body parts were considered more valuable than others. The heart was the most desired organ, followed by the head, arms, legs, and vital organs. Next in importance were hands and feet, followed by minor fragments such as fingers or toes. These relics were often preserved.
There was a frequent use of eviscerating the cadaver immediately and embalming saints, and this was commonly used for holy persons immediately after they died. The viscera would be placed in an urn and presumably would decay.
Then, in the Middle Ages, a number of remarkable corpses began to turn up when the church exhumed some damaged coffins in order to rebury the bodies. It discovered that though they supposedly were not embalmed, these bodies, long dead, appeared fresh.
They were extraordinary. In some cases, their hands and their fingernails, their toenails were exceptionally well preserved.
Today, most of the bodies appear wizened and mummy-like. Yet when the corpses were exhumed, medical and ecclesiastical eyewitnesses attested to their lifelike appearance.
They were moist, they were supple. Their skin was creamy and soft and untouched looking. Their eyes were open, their eyes were shiny.
The devout came to regard the incorrupt preservations of holy persons as miraculous.
Death was not something that was locked away at that time. People in medieval Europe would have seen death on the streets, in their homes. And so when they came across a body, particularly the body of someone who was a very holy person, a very good person, and when that body was exceptionally well preserved, it must have really astonished them.
By the year 1200, incorruption was seen by the Church as a sign of God's favor, and sometimes accepted as one of the required miracles for sainthood.
After the idea of incorruptibility becomes attached to the idea of sainthood, then you exhume the body. One of the things you're looking for is to see if there is this sign of incorruptibility.
50 years after her death in 1320, the body of Dominican nun Margaret of Città di Castello was exhumed when her coffin was found rotting away. As it was opened, witnesses reportedly were mesmerized by what they saw. Although Margaret's clothing had become dust, the body was found to be perfectly preserved and flexible. Physicians claimed it was not embalmed. Many miracles were recorded after Margaret's exhumation, and in 1609 she was beatified, a step on the road to sainthood.
The incorruptibles were seen as a divine lightning rod. They were said to give the blind sight. They were said to give hearing to the deaf. They had the power to give fertility to the barren, to allow the crippled to get up and walk again. They were said to be able to heal lepers. There was a whole host of miracles that were attributed to the power of the incorruptibles.
Seeking a favor or a cure, the faithful set out during the Middle Ages on pilgrimages to places where relics were enshrined. Cities such as Rome were important destinations and hosted thousands of pilgrims daily.
These places became immensely popular. There was so much competition in the Middle Ages between which shrine had the best relic, the most powerful relic, the most miraculous relic. Thousands of people would pour into these places, and the aisles would be lined with sick and dying people.
The frenzy over relics began to subside by the Reformation in the 16th century. During that time, Christians opposed to relic veneration destroyed entire bodies. Still, the saints who remain have amazing stories to tell. They ooze, glow, exude, sit up, and levitate. You are watching Saints Preserved on the History Channel. The extraordinary preservation of the saints' bodies has confounded the faithful from the earliest days of Christianity. Even more confounding is that some of the corpses have reportedly exhibited uncommon physical behavior, known as thanatological phenomena. Since the 19th century, some 700 examples have been identified.
When an incorruptible is discovered, it is not only found to be whole, but it is found to be soft to the touch, with a rosy complexion, or it can still bleed. These are special conditions of the corpse that are well classified by thanatology. So we have the guiding concept that science can explain many things, but it doesn't explain why a phenomenon happens at that moment and on that occasion.
A wonderfully strange odor is said to have exuded from many of the preserved saints. This exquisite fragrance, called the odor of sanctity, is supposedly unlike any earthly scent. It permeates the air with an indescribable sweetness that persists for months or even years. When Catherine of Bologna died at age 50 in 1463, she was buried in the ground without a coffin at the monastery known today as Corpus Domini.
She was a member of the Poor Clares, and that's an organization that devotes itself to austerity, so that she was buried as per Poor Clares tradition without a coffin, just put the body in the bare ground.
Immediately, the nuns were startled by a sweet scent coming from the grave. It persisted, wafting across the graveyard and perfuming the entire village.
They say it lasted in the graveyard for weeks, and that people would start to come to the graveyard bringing their sick children and would claim that there were miraculous cures, and that it was because of this recently dead nun who was, not that famous in her time, but she was becoming famous after death.
After 18 days, the nuns exhumed Catherine to bury her in a coffin. Doctors noted the condition of her body.
It looked like it was just freshly dead. There was not a bruise, not a mark, and it was creamy and fresh.
These doctors did affirm the miraculous nature of some of the cures that were attributed to Catherine of Bologna, and it was partially because of their testimony that she was canonized as a saint.
St. Catherine's limbs showed no sign of rigor mortis. In fact, she remained so flexible 12 years after her death that the nuns enshrined her in a sitting position. It's a phenomenon that defies modern science.
Non è inspiegabile questo. Noi non dobbiamo immaginare per la
Some flexibility is not impossible, but I can tell you that 12 years after her death is problematic. I can find flexibility a few years after death, but so many years are unlikely.
The saint's upright position actually may have a calming effect on pilgrims.
I could see them becoming more and more relaxed just looking at the relic. When the relic is sitting up in a chair, as opposed to just lying flat on a platform, it looks more human, in a way more alive, even though you know it's dead. So that there's a quality of, it's a good listener.
In life, many of the preserved saints, including Catherine of Bologna, claim to have had ecstatic visions of the Virgin Mary, known in theology as Marian apparitions.
At the beginning of the 19th century in France, all of a sudden we get a string of people who claim to have seen the Virgin Mary and to have received communications from her. Many of them were also given something by the Virgin. Catherine Labourant was one such person.
Catherine Labourant was a young nun at a Paris convent when she saw something at an evening church service that none of the other nuns seemed to notice.
And that was the Virgin manifesting overhead, above all their heads, in a beautiful white gown, standing on a white globe and holding a golden globe between her fingers. And as she manifested there, golden letters started forming in the air around her.
They turned out to be a prayer. O Mary, conceived without sin, pray for us who have recourse to thee. Mary supposedly told Catherine to create medals with those words on them. It became known as the miraculous medal.
It was a kind of fearful time in Paris. It was shortly after the French Revolution had ended. So tens of thousands of these medals were struck and distributed and were immensely popular. People felt that it gave them divine favor, that they were having miraculous cures, that they had been saved from fires and illness.
While the medal may not be as wildly popular as it once was, Catherine Labourant continues to draw visitors to the Paris chapel where she's enshrined. She died in 1876, and church officials exhumed her body 57 years later for beatification ceremonies.
They say it didn't even look freshly dead, it looked still alive. And they say that two of her nun sisters, fainted at the sight because it was so lifelike. You know, it was just as if their friend was still there. And one thing about her in her life was that she was said to have beautiful, beautiful blue eyes. So when she was exhumed, part of the story is that her eyes were wide open and they were just as beautiful as ever.
At the exhumation, Catherine's corpse was treated with chemicals to preserve its suppleness and color. Another 19th century French woman, Saint Bernadette Soubirous of Lourdes, claimed to have been visited by the Virgin 18 times. In 1858, she was gathering firewood along a riverbank when she heard a noise in the bush above a nearby grotto. Bernadette looked up to see something white in the form of a young girl whom she believed was Mary. In anticipation of a miracle, growing crowds followed Bernadette during subsequent visits to the grotto. Soon, the devout began to claim miraculous properties for the grotto's water. Having endured ill health her entire life, Bernadette died in 1879 at the age of 35.
Bernadette was in pain for a good deal of her life and never complained about it, and people only found out about it when she died, and they discovered the tubercular remnants in her body.
During an exhumation in 1909, Bernadette's body was found incorrupt. 10 years later, the body was exhumed again, and a wax mask was placed over the face. A shrine at Lourdes attracts millions of faithful, and its water is popularly credited with countless healing miracles. Many of the mystical experiences of the preserved saints are common among holy people.
We see lights around them. Almost all of the saints are people of deep prayer who have had either private mystical contact with God and angelic beings, or have reported upon their contacts with the supernatural. So the types of things that happen to the incorruptibles, levitation, all of these things go along with the saintliness.
In 1417, 26-year-old Rita of Cascia entered the St. Mary Magdalene convent. Sometime after her arrival, she prayed to God for a favor at this altar.
St. Rita of Cascia asked God to let her participate in the sufferings of Jesus Christ. So she was rewarded, as she saw it, with a wound on her forehead, which resembled the wound from a thorn in the crown of thorns. Now, this wound not only festered, but gave off, they say, a horrible odor for the rest of her life. She lived much of the rest of her life in seclusion.
Just days before her death in 1457, a fragrant odor filled her chamber and then overwhelmed the entire convent. A bright light emanated from the wound in her forehead. When she died, she was buried in an ornate sarcophagus. 170 years later, Rita's body was exhumed for beatification ceremonies.
It's said that when she was exhumed, one of her eyes popped open spontaneously. It's also said that her body changed position. When it was put on display over the years, it was kind of lying on one side and then it moved to another side. Also, some say that they saw it levitating straight up to the top of the sarcophagus.
A dry stick of wood planted by Rita during her youth is said to have blossomed into a grapevine. It still grows in the courtyard of St. Rita's monastery.
They say that powdered leaves from the grapevine are sent to sick people who request it all over the world.
In the 12th century, stories were told of Christian martyrs' blood exuding and boiling from the ground where it fell. Similarly, some preserved saints were said to exude blood or unusual fluids for weeks, months, and even years after death.
This is a post-mortem phenomenon because the blood has become fluid again. The exceptional thing is to find it so long after death.
The The Church of the Gesù in Rome is world headquarters for the Jesuit order of priests. Enshrined inside is a relic, the mummified arm of St. Francis Xavier, one of the Jesuits' most celebrated missionaries. In 1540, he sailed to the East Indies.
King John of Portugal wanted a missionary to go to India. So Xavier went, he was seasick the whole time, got to India, and there began his fame. He converted tens of thousands.
Francis died on a ship bound for China in 1552. 2 years later, his incorrupt body was enshrined in Goa, India, where thousands venerated him. But skeptics proposed that the body was embalmed. To settle the issue, the chief medical authority examined the body and found no evidence of artificial preservation. Still, the chief instructed a colleague to put his fingers inside an old wound near the heart. When he pulled his fingers out, they were reportedly covered in fresh blood, which the chief smelled and pronounced absolutely untainted. Soon, churches around the world were requesting Francis's relics.
Half of one hand went to what is now Hanoi, another half went to what is now, I think, Singapore. That's one hand being cut in half. His organs were sent out so that when the full body was put on display, it was pretty much empty inside, and they had put, metal and cotton structures inside to fill it out.
When some bodies started to disintegrate after their removal from burial vaults, doubts were raised about their authenticity. By the Age of Enlightenment in the 18th century, the Church began to ask questions about incorruption.
They're certainly worried about such things because they're afraid of fraud, they're afraid of hoaxes, they're afraid of diabolical miracles. St. Paul says that the devil can appear as an angel of light, and he can certainly appear as an incorrupt corpse from the past.
Are the saints a miracle, kept whole and lifelike by an act of God? Or is there a rational scientific explanation for these amazing preservations? You are watching Saints Preserved on the History Channel. By the early 18th century, the Church was growing increasingly suspicious of claims for miracles and attempted to set a standard for incorruption. It turned to Cardinal Prospero Lambertini, the recognized authority on canonization causes. In 1734, he addressed the question of incorruption in a 5-volume treatise he wrote on canonization.
His criteria were extremely strict. He believed that in cases where there was any corruption whatsoever, for instance, a body could be perfectly preserved except for the nose and the lips, and he says that's out. It's not considered a miracle because there is some corruption.
According to Lambertini, bodies that were embalmed or were desiccated, naturally dried and mummified, could not be deemed miracles of incorruption. Only those bodies that retained their lifelike freshness for many years without deliberate intervention could be considered miraculous. Still, this didn't resolve the issue, since examiners weren't always impartial when it came to a favorite candidate. It took 2 centuries before a new view of the preserved saints began to emerge. In the late 1980s, science and the Catholic Church joined forces to shed light on the mystery of the saints' preservation.
The Church hopes to learn something more about the saints. Quite often the legends of the saints are fairly incomplete. And so the Church has really been happy to have people who are experts check that they're in a good state of conservation, and also to learn as much as possible about these extraordinary individuals.
At the Vatican's request, teams of Italian pathologists, microbiologists, chemists, and radiologists pored over the bodies of the ancient men and women interred in church reliquaries. Before any work began, experts were required to pledge their respect for the corpse as if it were a living person and to complete all work with professional competence. Then, a final oath.
Ma il terzo giuramento, che è il più importante,
The third oath, which is the most important, is the absolute pursuit of truth, even in the face of unexpected results.
Di imprevisti.
In other words, one swears to tell the truth always, pleasant or unpleasant though it may be.
Piacevole che questa sia.
As each exam began, the body was carefully unclothed.
Bodies are first examined visually for any signs of preservation methods, and then quite often what will happen is that very small bits of tissue samples will be taken from the bodies of the saints in order to run medical tests of a variety of sorts. In some cases, small cameras will be threaded on endoscopes through the oral cavities of the incorruptibles, and just a host of scientific procedures will be carried out.
In 1988, scientists examined the body of Margaret of Cortona, a Tuscan saint who had been dead for 700 years.
St. Margaret is one of the better preserved incorruptibles, I would say. Her skin is light and firm. Her fingernails are all intact, her toenails. I mean, she's one of the marvels of the incorruptibles.
Margaret began her life as a free-spirited 13th century woman who lived in luxury as the mistress of a wealthy man. But she had a remarkable change of heart after following her dog to a makeshift grave that held her murdered lover's body.
She realized that her wicked ways had really not served her well. She became a devout Catholic, and she performed many good works in the city of Cortona. She founded hospitals and was a wonderful woman.
The people of Cortona came to venerate Margaret so much that after her death in 1297, they pleaded for her canonization. In 1719, Margaret's body was examined and deemed incorrupt, intact, and joined together with all its limbs, tendons, and features. But when doctors re-examined the body in 1988, they discovered that it was indeed intact, but for a reason other than incorruption.
The oath became very important here, working with utmost professional competence and reporting what we had found, because in this case, we had found an artificially mummified body.
After Margaret's death, 13th century embalmers had done an expert job of preserving her.
They removed her internal organs, and they anointed her body with unguents that would have antibacterial properties. And so they really did assist in the process of her remarkable preservation.
While working on the mummy, the team of scientists discovered that the circumstances of St. Margaret's preservation were well chronicled in church records. It turns out that Cortona's villagers asked the church to preserve the body. However, over time, the fact of their request was forgotten, and Margaret's corpse became understood as incorrupt.
The people see a splendid body, a body that is marvelously preserved, they believe, by divine intervention.
During the first examination of Margaret's body in 1719, the fragrance of unguents and spices was detected. But the examiner never thoroughly undressed Margaret to see the extensive incisions that had been made prior to her original burial.
When St. Margaret was examined in previous centuries, there had been a real sense of modesty that really prohibited the examiners from really checking out her body thoroughly. So they would only lift up her dress just a little bit to see what the condition of her skin and body was.
Margaret's embalmers seem to have borrowed from the Egyptian tradition of mummification, a technique likely adopted by the Jews during their long slavery in Egypt. Yet Margaret's preservation was more radical. Her internal organs had been cut out.
I think that St. Margaret was subjected to these more drastic measures because people wanted to take her internal organs and to distribute them to other churches as sacred relics. So it was a sense of trying to pass on the goodness and wonder of St. Margaret.
Today, the city of Cortona continues to venerate Margaret with an annual celebration on February 22nd.
Che spinsero il popolo di Cortona a conservare Santa Margherita Cortona.
What compelled the people of Cortona to preserve the body of Saint Margaret of Cortona was an act of love.
Le immagini, le fotografie.
After all, today we save the photographs of our dear ones, and it is the same sentiment. We don't want to lose the memory.
Legati a questa persona.
Among those once acknowledged as incorrupt saints and blesseds, researchers have found 10 others in Italy that have been artificially mummified, like St. Margaret of Cortona. Most are women, and all, including St. Rita of Cascia and Blessed Margaret of Città di Castello, lived in Tuscany and Umbria during the 14th and 15th centuries. Yet the preservation of other saints cannot be attributed to the work of embalmers.
You cannot believe this person's been this way for 700 years. You're thinking, how did this happen?
You're watching Saints Preserved on the History Channel. For centuries, Saint Zita has laid on a bed of brocade in a chapel in Lucca, Italy. She's one of the most admired icons of Roman Catholics.
You cannot believe this person's been this way for 700 years, and there are signs around saying non-embalsamato. It hasn't been embalmed, and so if that's true, you're thinking, how did this happen?
Zita was born in 1218 to a poor family. At age 12, she began work as a domestic servant in the home of a wealthy Lucca merchant.
She was instantly the most unpopular person in the household. The fellow servants didn't like her. She was such a pious goody-goody. She was always fasting and praying, and she insisted on sleeping on a cold, bare stone floor. They didn't like that. They thought she was kind of showing off.
Still, her acts of kindness were legendary.
She would feed the poor with food from the master's pantry, and the legends are that the pantry would miraculously refill, and that angels would help her bake bread, and that once she loaned her coat in a cold rainstorm to what turned out a beggar that turned out to be an angel.
She died in 1278 after performing her duties faithfully for 48 years. Her body was buried in the church where she is still enshrined.
It's said that upon her death, the church bells started ringing spontaneously. Instantly, people were coming to that church, wanting to be near the body and saying that it was miraculous and had miraculous powers.
About 300 years later, Zita's body was exhumed in response to calls for her canonization. She was found perfectly preserved.
The officials at the time were really stunned by the state of her preservation, and there were a number of miracles that were recorded at the time. And so, of course, she became a very important saint in Tuscany.
Another 400 years later, in 1988, Zita's body was re-examined and not a trace of embalming was found. Scientists dubbed her a natural mummy.
The body of Saint Zita is very well preserved. In my opinion, is probably the best mummy, the best natural mummy I know in Italy.
Strangely, although heat and humidity promote decomposition in a corpse, the church vault where St. Zita originally was interred was extremely humid. Researchers pointed to Zita's stone sarcophagus as a preventive measure against decay, but the examination revealed the presence of something else that likely played a key role in her remarkable preservation.
The level of lead was extremely high. The only possible explanation is contemporary doctors of St. Zita used some drugs with lead. The presence of lead could cause an antiseptic activity against microbes in the body, and this presence could stop the decay of the body.
Among the 50 or so preserved saints in Italy, researchers have identified a total of 29 naturally mummified bodies, including that of Catherine of Bologna. The mummies span hundreds of years, from the 4th to the 20th centuries. They were mainly buried beneath the sacred altars of churches, a common practice beginning in the 4th century. Researchers believe that the spontaneous mummifications were due to perfect conditions in certain burial vaults.
Le condizioni di questo ambiente confinato hanno
Under the conditions of this confined environment, very little exchange occurs with the external environment.
Allora si stabilizzano quelle condizioni.
And so temperature and humidity become stabilized, so no bacteria enters to contaminate the corpse.
The temperature in some of the crypts was about 58 degrees Fahrenheit. And this is a temperature which is below the most favorable threshold for bacterial growth. And so it's in some cases, these crypts would have been sort of natural mummifiers.
The Tuscan highlands in central Italy is a dry, mountainous region. There, in the small community of Novelli, the floor inside the crypts of the San Sebastiano church collapsed in 1980. Researchers were stunned to find a treasure trove of some 250 natural mummies of villagers dating from the 19th century.
The condition of the vaults inside the crypts allowed natural mummification because the circulation of air inside allowed the dehydration of soft tissues that represents the main requirement for the preservation of the bodies. We also found traces of lime between the corpse, and this may have played a role in the preservation of them because it's well known as an antibacterial agent.
Just 10 feet away from the crypt, bodies inside a tunnel were decomposed.
We found only skeletons and bones due to the presence of a water infiltration inside the tunnel.
While pathological evidence explains the preservation of some saints, others remain a mystery.
Science doesn't account for everything.
You are watching Saints Preserved on the History Channel. In 15th century Genoa, the poor and sick had a great friend in Catherine Fieschi Adorno, who worked tirelessly on their behalf in the city hospital.
A plague decimated the town of Genoa. Something like 75% of the population is said to have been wiped out. And she forthrightly worked, risking her health to work through this plague. And so she gained a reputation then as being a very holy person, a very caring person.
When Catherine died in 1510, she was buried in the hospital's chapel for 18 months before her water-damaged casket was opened. Although Catherine's shroud was wet, eyewitnesses said her body was incorrupt.
Finding the body incorrupt was what sparked the cultus, the veneration of her as a saint. What usually happens is that a holy person is venerated as a saint, and then sometimes their body is found incorrupt, and that just adds to the to the mystique and to the veneration.
Some 450 years later, in 1960, physicians re-examined St. Catherine of Genoa. They concluded that although the relic was dark and dry, it had not been embalmed or naturally mummified.
Santa Caterina da Genova viene sepolta.
St. Catherine was buried, isolated, without other cadavers close by, with no new introduction of bacteria. Water infiltrated the church wall and, along with humidity, corroded the casket and dissolved Catherine's clothes. So the unexplainable event is that in those conditions, the body of Catherine was completely preserved.
While the phenomenon of incorruption in some saints remains a mystery, the Catholic Church has not disregarded the mountain of pathological evidence on natural and artificial mummies. In recent years, it has reconsidered the phenomenon of incorruption as a miraculous sign of sainthood.
As people began to study the decay process, and as they began to study the process of mummification, the Catholic Church really started to kind of back away from the whole doctrine of incorruptibility.
Pope John Paul II, who is a champion beatifier and canonizer, has changed the rules because he recognizes that many of the things that were declared miraculous in the past would not be declared miraculous now.
Still, many find it difficult to suppress a sense of astonishment in the presence of a saint's preserved body. Modern pilgrims bring mementos of themselves and their loved ones and pray for miracles. All around the saint's remains, they lay scribbled thank you notes, declaring loyalty, asking for favors.
As a man of science, I must find all the conditions that have favored a particular mummification. While for believers, it will be the result of divine intervention.
The incorruptibles are venerated first and foremost because they were saintly people, and it is their saintliness and the individual miracles around them for which they are remembered.
The faithful may be in danger of losing some of their beloved relics. Changing environmental and microclimate conditions are likely to alter the preservation of the saints' bodies over time.
Just think of the lighting, the temperature resulting from the heating systems, the environmental pollution, the vibrations from the soil. And so bodies that had remained incorruptible and perfect for hundreds of years suddenly start to deteriorate, to show signs of decay.
Over the years, the bodies of some saints have required restoration to make them presentable for exhibition. Catherine Labourè's upturned hands are made of wax. Rita of Cassia's eyebrow and cheekbone have been repaired with wax and string. A light coat of wax protects Catherine of Bologna's hands and feet. In December 2000, Italian scientists and church representatives met in L'Aquila, Italy, to discuss the care of the preserved saints. L'Aquila was chosen for its historical and religious importance, as it has enshrined several natural mummies of saints dating from the 15th century. The preserved saints were declared a national treasure, deserving of support for both scientific study and conservation.
These were historically important people. Countless things have been created, written, composed about these people. And so the need to conserve them becomes important. It is like conserving a cultural heritage.
The saint's legacy is filled with acts of faith, love, and mercy, and the remarkable preservations add luster to their status. For many, They stand as a testimony to life after death, their preservation a sign of hope.
History Channel exclusive.
There are things down there that have still not been seen.
Right over here we got something.
Unbelievable.
This is the entire bottom of the ship.
Forget what you know. Titanic's final moments. Sunday at 9.